Yesterday, I was sitting in a waiting room. Nothing special. Plastic chairs, a flickering light, people scrolling endlessly on their phones. Across from me, a man in his early 30s kept checking his watch every 10 seconds. Not because he was late, he wasn't. He just looked restless. After a while, he laughed to himself and said, "I don't even know what I'm waiting for." That sentence stayed with me, because a few weeks earlier, I had spoken to a researcher who studies something strange. Not happiness, not success, not trauma, but anticipation. Not what happens when we get things, but what happens before. He didn't call it motivation. He didn't call it ambition. He called it the engine. He told me, most people think they're chasing goals. They're not. They're chasing the feeling that something better is just ahead. And here's the unsettling part. He said that feeling doesn't disappear when life improves. It intensifies. Think about it for a second. When life is hard, you hope things will change. When life gets better, you start expecting more. A better job, a better version of yourself, a better relationship, a better future. And that's when dissatisfaction becomes permanent. The researcher didn't sit me down for an interview. We were walking. He stopped suddenly and asked me a question I wasn't prepared for. Do you know why people feel more restless now than at any point in history? I gave the usual answers. Phones, capitalism, social media, pressure. He shook his head. Those are amplifiers, not the source. Then he said something uncomfortable. Human beings evolved to want what they don't have. Modern life just removed the limits. That explains something we rarely talk about. Why rest feels boring. Why success doesn't calm us. Why love starts as obsession and turns into maintenance. Why the moment we arrive, we start planning the next escape. He told me this chemical in the brain, he avoided its name at first, lights up not when we enjoy, but when we expect. It doesn't reward peace, it rewards pursuit. Which means, the moment you stop chasing, it goes quiet. And silence feels wrong to a brain trained on noise. I thought back to that man in the waiting room. I don't even know what I'm waiting for. Maybe none of us do. Maybe we're not chasing better lives. Maybe we're chasing the feeling of becoming. And maybe that's why contentment feels suspicious, why stillness feels uncomfortable, why enough never registers. This is not a story about weakness or lack of gratitude or modern failure. This is a story about a perfectly functioning brain in a world that never lets it rest. And if we don't understand that, we'll keep mistaking restlessness for purpose and desire for meaning. Sit back. Take a breath. You're listening to Wise Alchemy. Let's begin. He told me, I've spent my entire life trying to understand one thing. Not happiness, not success, not trauma. He said, I wanted to understand why people feel unsettled, even when their lives are fine. We were sitting on a bench outside the building where he worked. Nothing dramatic, just late afternoon light and traffic noise drifting in and out. I asked him what he meant by unsettled. He didn't answer right away. He watched a woman walk past us, scrolling on her phone, almost colliding with a man coming the other way. They both laughed awkwardly, said sorry, and kept walking, faster than before. He said, that. I laughed. That's just people being distracted. He smiled, not amused, not dismissive, more like someone hearing a familiar excuse. No, he said softly, That's people trying to outrun a feeling. That line stuck because I knew exactly what he meant. That strange pressure to keep moving, the discomfort of doing nothing, the itch to check something, anything, even when there's nothing waiting. I told him it feels like anxiety sometimes. He shook his head. Anxiety has an object, he said. This doesn't. That's when it hit me. This feeling doesn't come from fear. It comes from absence, the absence of what's next. We talked about how people describe their lives now. I should be happier. I don't know why I feel like this. Nothing is wrong, but something feels off. He leaned forward slightly, lowered his voice, almost like he didn't want the thought overheard. Most people think contentment is the default state, he said. It never was. That sentence felt dangerous because it quietly challenges everything we're promised. We're told that if we get enough, security, love, freedom, success, our minds will finally rest. But what if the mind was never designed to rest there? I asked him if this was a modern problem. Phones, noise, speed, pressure. He let out a short breath through his nose. Modern life didn't create this, he said. It just removed the pauses. Back in the waiting room yesterday, I thought about that. The man checking his watch. 10 seconds. Again. Again. Not late, not impatient, just unable to sit inside stillness. I've felt that too. You probably have. That moment when silence stretches a little too long, and instead of peace, you feel exposed. Like you're supposed to want something. Like you're falling behind without moving. The researcher told me something else that day. He said, people don't suffer because they want too much. They suffer because wanting never switches off. Think about how early it starts. Children bored after opening gifts. Teenagers restless even when accepted. Adults chasing calm that keeps receding. We blame ourselves. Lack of gratitude, lack of discipline, lack of purpose. But what if this restlessness isn't a personal failure? What if it's a built-in signal, doing exactly what it was designed to do? I asked him the question everyone asks at this point. So what's the fix? He looked genuinely surprised. Why do you assume it needs fixing? That's when I realized something uncomfortable. We don't actually want peace. We want movement that feels meaningful. And when movement stops, the mind creates noise to replace it. That's why stillness feels suspicious. Why enough feels temporary. Why reaching a goal often feels emptier than chasing it. The researcher stood up, checked the time, and said one last thing before leaving. Before people understand their brains, he said, they need to stop moralizing their feelings. Because this isn't about weakness, or lack of ambition, or modern decay. It's about a perfectly functioning system operating in a world that never tells it when to stop. And before we talk about chemicals, or neuroscience, or names, we need to sit with the feeling itself. The wanting, the reaching, the unease. Because once you recognize it, you'll start seeing it everywhere. And that's where the real story begins. He didn't take me straight into the lab. First, we stood behind a glass wall. Inside the room, everything looked ordinary. White walls, soft hum of machines, a desk, a screen glowing faintly in the dim light. People often imagine labs as dramatic places. Blinking lights, people in coats rushing around. This wasn't like that. It looked boring, which is exactly why what happened next stayed with me. The researcher leaned slightly toward me and said, "This is where we learned that satisfaction doesn't calm the brain." Inside the room, a volunteer sat in front of a screen. On the screen was a simple task. Press a button. Sometimes a reward appears. Nothing exciting. At first, the volunteer pressed the button casually, almost lazily. Press, wait, press, wait. Then something changed. The reward appeared, unpredictable, not every time, and suddenly the rhythm shifted. Press, press, press. Faster now, leaning forward, eyes locked. I asked the researcher, "So the reward is addictive?" He shook his head immediately. "That's the mistake everyone makes. We thought that too." The machines didn't measure happiness, they didn't measure pleasure. They measured anticipation. And here's what startled them. The volunteer's brain lit up before the reward appeared. Not during, not after. Before. That means the brain wasn't responding to the reward, it was responding to the possibility. The researcher lowered his voice, almost like he was telling a secret he still felt uneasy about. When the reward actually arrived, he said, the activity dropped. Dropped. As if the brain lost interest the moment reality caught up. I watched the volunteer receive the reward. No smile, no visible joy, just a brief pause. Then, pressing again. Faster, more urgent, as if the reward wasn't the point anymore. I felt a knot form in my stomach, because suddenly this wasn't about a lab. This was about us. The researcher walked me down the hallway, past more rooms just like that one. Different experiments, same pattern. Animals, humans, different cultures, different ages. Same result. The brain doesn't celebrate arrival, he said. It celebrates pursuit. That explains something deeply unsettling. Why reaching goals feels strangely empty. Why vacations feel best before they start. Why new relationships burn brightest before they settle. And why the moment you get what you wanted, something inside you says, "What's next?" I asked him why evolution would build something like this. He stopped walking, looked straight at me. Because a brain that rests doesn't survive. This system wasn't designed for happiness. It was designed for movement, for exploration, for risk, for reaching beyond what already exists. A brain satisfied with the present would never leave the cave, never cross the ocean, never invent anything. But here's the twist. Modern life solved many survival problems, yet this system never switched off. So now it fires constantly. Jobs, likes, messages, goals, dreams, always almost there, never enough. The researcher finally said the word, casually, like it wasn't dangerous at all. That chemical has a name. Dopamine. He didn't explain it yet. He didn't define it. He just let it sit between us. Because once you hear that word, you start noticing its fingerprints everywhere. In ambition, in addiction, in love, in anxiety. In that man in the waiting room. I don't even know what I'm waiting for. Maybe now we do. Not a thing, not a goal, but a feeling that something better is just ahead. And the cruel part, the moment it arrives, the system moves on. He warned me before we talked about this part. Not formally, not dramatically, just a quiet sentence said while we were standing near the exit. "This is where people get uncomfortable," he said, "because they like believing love is different. Different from ambition, different from addiction, different from restlessness. We want love to be the one place where wanting finally ends." But when he pulled up the data, it told a different story. The first image on the screen wasn't a brain scan. It was a couple. Young, close, smiling at each other like nothing else existed. He said, "This is when people think they're happiest." I nodded, because we all recognize that moment. The intensity, the obsession, the way the world narrows down to one person. You check your phone constantly. You replay conversations. You imagine futures you haven't lived yet. It feels meaningful. It feels alive. It feels like purpose. He changed the image. Now the same couple, months later. Comfortable, familiar, still affectionate, but quieter. The brain activity told a brutal truth. The system that was on fire before had calmed down. Not because love disappeared, but because novelty did. This, he said, tapping the screen, is where people start thinking something is wrong. They say, I don't feel the same. It doesn't excite me anymore. Maybe we're not meant to be. But the brain isn't saying leave, it's saying there is nothing new to chase. That realization hits hard because it reframes so many stories we tell ourselves. Why attraction feels like destiny. Why stability feels like boredom. Why people confuse intensity with truth. The researcher told me something that almost felt cruel. Love doesn't start calm, he said. It starts loud. Because the same system that lights up for possibility lights up for people who feel like possibility. Someone new isn't just a person. They're a future, a story, an escape, a better version of yourself imagined. That's why early love feels electric. Not because it's deeper, but because it's unfinished. I thought about every time someone said, I miss how it used to feel. They weren't missing the person, they were missing the anticipation. The researcher leaned back and smiled, gently, almost apologetically. This doesn't mean love is fake, he said. It means we've misunderstood what phase we're in. The wanting phase feels magical. The maintaining phase feels invisible. And our culture only celebrates the first. Movies end at the kiss. Songs stop at the chase. Stories freeze before reality settles in. No one teaches us what happens after the wanting quiets. So when it does, we panic. We assume something broke, or worse, we broke. I asked him the question everyone asks next. So, are we doomed to lose interest? He shook his head. No, he said, but you can't live forever on anticipation. That system is brilliant at starting things, terrible at sustaining them, which means mature love requires something else, something slower, something less dramatic, something the brain doesn't reward with fireworks. And that's why it feels harder, because it doesn't feel like movement. It feels like staying, choosing, showing up, repeating care without novelty. That's not exciting to the wanting system, but it's everything to a life. I remembered the man in the waiting room again. I don't even know what I'm waiting for. Maybe it was never a thing. Maybe it was always a feeling. And maybe we keep mistaking that feeling for love, for purpose, for meaning. He stopped talking after that. Not because he was finished, but because the silence said more than the explanation ever could. I thanked him. We didn't shake hands dramatically. We just walked in opposite directions. And on my way home, I realized something. This wasn't really about ambition, or success, or even chemistry. It was about how quietly our minds push us forward, and how rarely we ask where. The next morning, something small happened. I was sleeping when a bird kept knocking against my glass window. Not once, not twice, again, and again, and again. I woke up frustrated, not because the sound was loud, but because it wouldn't stop. I sat up in bed, eyes half open, heart already tense for no reason I could explain. Outside, the city was still waking up. Inside, my mind was already racing. The bird wasn't panicking. It wasn't confused. It was focused. There was sky on the other side of the glass, and that was enough. It didn't understand windows. It didn't question the barrier. It didn't stop to rethink its strategy. It just kept moving toward what it wanted. And that's when something uncomfortable clicked. That bird wasn't failing. It was functioning perfectly. And so are we. We grow up believing ambition is a choice, that some people are ambitious and others are content. But ambition isn't a personality trait. It's a biological rhythm. a system that evolved long before job titles, calendars, or deadlines. The brain doesn't reward achievement. It rewards anticipation. The chase lights it up. The expectation. The possibility that something better is just ahead. That's why the moment you arrive, the feeling fades. You get the promotion. You feel proud, briefly. Then the mind quietly asks, what's next? Not because you're greedy, not because you're ungrateful, but because the system that pushed you there has already moved on. It doesn't know how to celebrate. It only knows how to point forward. That's why rest feels strange. Have you noticed that? How sitting still too long starts to feel wrong. Not painful, just uncomfortable. As if you're forgetting something, missing something, falling behind something unnamed. That's not laziness. That's a brain trained to equate movement with safety. Think about how often we say things like, I'll relax after this project. I'll be happy when I reach that goal. I'll finally breathe once this phase is over. But the phase never ends. It just changes clothes. Burnout doesn't come from effort. It comes from effort without arrival. From climbing stairs that rearrange themselves while you're climbing. From waking up tired, not because you worked too hard yesterday, but because tomorrow is already waiting. And ambition plays a clever trick. It disguises exhaustion as motivation. It whispers, just a little more. And because it sounds reasonable, we listen. I thought again about the man in the waiting room. I don't even know what I'm waiting for. That sentence hits harder the more you sit with it, because most of us aren't chasing specific goals anymore. We're chasing relief, a feeling that never quite arrives. And when it doesn't, we don't question the chase. We question ourselves. What's wrong with me? Why can't I just be satisfied? Why do I feel empty after getting what I wanted? But nothing is wrong with you. You're not broken. You're just living inside a system that never learned how to stop. That bird eventually flew away. Not because it understood the glass, but because something else caught its attention. And I realized something quietly unsettling. Ambition doesn't stop when it hits a wall. It stops when it finds a new direction. And if we never choose that direction consciously, it will be chosen for us. By comparison, by pressure, by noise, by expectation. So maybe the real danger isn't ambition itself. Maybe it's ambition without reflection, movement without meaning, effort without orientation. Because if we never ask where we're going, we'll spend our lives moving and still feel stuck. And that brings us to the next question. Not a loud one, not an inspiring one, a quiet one. One most people avoid. What if slowing down doesn't mean falling behind, but finally seeing where you are? After that morning with the bird, I started noticing something strange. Not in other people first, in myself. The way my mind kept postponing peace. I'd catch myself thinking things like, I'll feel better once this week is over. I'll relax after this project. I'll enjoy life when things settle down. And every time I reached that moment, it moved. Have you noticed that too? How happiness always seems to live slightly ahead of you. Not far enough to give up on, just far enough to keep chasing. A few days later, I brought this up with the researcher again. Not formally, just in passing. And he smiled. Not amused, but familiar. Like someone who had heard this question thousands of times. He said, "The brain is very bad at living in the present. not because the present is unpleasant, but because the present is predictable. That sentence stayed with me. Predictable, safe, quiet. And for a brain wired for survival, quiet feels suspicious. The promise of later. We grow up making deals with ourselves, small ones at first. I'll play after homework. I'll rest after exams. I'll enjoy life after I succeed. At some point, those deals stop being temporary. They become a lifestyle. We postpone joy the same way we postpone rest, not intentionally, not dramatically, just automatically. The future becomes a container for everything good, and the present becomes something to endure. That's what psychologists quietly call delayed life syndrome, living as if real life hasn't started yet, as if now is only preparation. And here's the cruel part. The brain loves this arrangement because anticipation feels better than arrival. The moment before something happens, chemically louder than the moment it actually does. So when you imagine a better future, a calmer version of yourself, a more successful life, a happier relationship, your brain lights up. But when you finally get there, the light dims. Not because the moment is bad, but because the system that created desire has already moved forward. It's like chasing a horizon. You can walk forever and never touch it. Think about how often happiness is framed as a destination. When I lose weight, when I make more money, when I find the right person, when things finally make sense. Each sentence contains a promise and a quiet lie. Because happiness isn't something the brain stores. It's something it briefly visits before continuing the search. That's why even good lives can feel strangely unfinished. I realized something uncomfortable. Most of us aren't unhappy because life is bad. We're unhappy because we're waiting for permission to enjoy what already exists, waiting for a version of ourselves we believe is more deserving, waiting for a moment that feels complete. But completeness is not a feeling the brain is built to deliver. It's built to keep you moving. And this creates a strange tension. The more you plan for happiness, the more distant it feels. The more you delay living, the more life starts to feel like a rehearsal. You don't notice it at first, but over time, something dulls. Moments blur. Weeks compress. Years pass faster than they should. And one day, you look back and think, when did I stop being here? The researcher said something else that day, almost as an afterthought. The brain prefers tomorrow because tomorrow can be improved. Today can only be accepted. And acceptance doesn't feel productive. It doesn't feel ambitious. It doesn't feel impressive. But it's the only place life actually happens. So maybe the trap isn't wanting more. Wanting is natural. Maybe the trap is believing happiness lives after life begins, instead of inside the messy, incomplete, ordinary moments we keep postponing. Because if we keep waiting to arrive, we might spend our entire lives in transit. And that leads us to a harder question. Not about happiness, but about meaning. If anticipation keeps us moving, what happens when we finally stop chasing? That's where we go next. After thinking about happiness always living in the future, I started noticing where my anticipation actually lived. Not in big dreams, not in long-term plans, but in my phone. I'd unlock it without thinking, not because I needed anything, but because something might be there. A message, a notification, a sign that something new had happened while I wasn't looking. And that's when it clicked. Social media isn't about connection, it's about possibility. Infinite scrolling feels harmless on the surface. Just one more swipe, just one more post, just one more video. But psychologically, each swipe carries a quiet promise. The next one might be better. That's not entertainment. That's anticipation on demand. A researcher once described it in a way I couldn't unhear. He said, social media doesn't reward you with pleasure. It rewards you with potential pleasure. And the brain loves potential more than fulfillment. Likes, comments, notifications, they don't arrive predictably. Sometimes there's nothing. Sometimes there's a lot. That unpredictability is the key. It trains the brain to stay alert, to keep checking, to stay slightly unsatisfied. Have you noticed how stopping feels harder than starting? You can open an app casually, but closing it feels like effort, like you're leaving something unfinished. That discomfort isn't weakness, it's conditioning. The brain has learned that silence might mean missing out. And then there's comparison. Not loud, not dramatic. Quiet. You see someone else's progress, someone else's happiness, someone else's moment. And suddenly, your own life feels paused. Not bad, just behind. That feeling isn't jealousy in the traditional sense. It's something more subtle. It's the sense that your future should be moving faster. Social media creates a strange distortion. You're not comparing your whole life to someone else's whole life. You're comparing your present to their highlight. And your brain doesn't know the difference. It only knows one thing. There's more out there. And once that belief sets in, stillness starts to feel like stagnation. Rest feels like falling behind. Silence feels empty. That's why boredom has almost disappeared and anxiety has taken its place. We don't sit with moments anymore. We fill them. Waiting rooms, elevators, even short pauses in conversation. The moment there's nothing happening, we reach. Not for after thinking about happiness always living in the future, I started noticing where my anticipation actually lived. Not in big dreams, not in long-term plans, but in my phone. I'd unlock it without thinking, not because I needed anything, but because something might be there. A message, a notification, a sign that something new had happened while I wasn't looking. And that's when it clicked. Social media isn't about connection, it's about possibility. Infinite scrolling feels harmless on the surface. Just one more swipe, just one more post, just one more video. But psychologically, each swipe carries a quiet promise. The next one might be better. That's not entertainment. That's anticipation on demand. A researcher once described it in a way I couldn't unhear. He said, social media doesn't reward you with pleasure. It rewards you with potential pleasure. And the brain loves potential more than fulfillment. Likes, comments, notifications, they don't arrive predictably. Sometimes there's nothing. Sometimes there's a lot. That unpredictability is the key. It trains the brain to stay alert, to keep checking, to stay slightly unsatisfied. Have you noticed how stopping feels harder than starting? You can open an app casually, but closing it feels like effort, like you're leaving something unfinished. That discomfort isn't weakness, it's conditioning. The brain has learned that silence might mean missing out. And then there's comparison. Not loud, not dramatic. Quiet. You see someone else's progress, someone else's happiness, someone else's moment. And suddenly, your own life feels paused. Not bad, just behind. That feeling isn't jealousy in the traditional sense. It's something more subtle. It's the sense that your future should be moving faster. Social media creates a strange distortion. You're not comparing your whole life to someone else's whole life. You're comparing your present to their highlight, and your brain doesn't know the difference. It only knows one thing: there's more out there. And once that belief sets in, stillness starts to feel like stagnation. Rest feels like falling behind. Silence feels empty. That's why boredom has almost disappeared and anxiety has taken its place. We don't sit with moments anymore. We fill them. Waiting rooms, elevators, even short pauses in conversation. The moment there's nothing happening, we reach. Not for connection, for stimulation, for the next possibility. Social media didn't create this system. It perfected it. It took the brain's natural anticipation engine and gave it unlimited fuel. No ending, no arrival, no satisfaction. Just constant motion. That's why quitting feels extreme. That's why taking a break feels dramatic. The brain isn't losing content. It's losing its sense of forward movement. And without movement, it feels lost. So when we say technology is addictive, we're missing something important. It's not the pleasure that hooks us. It's the promise. The feeling that something better is just one swipe away. And once the brain gets used to that speed, real life starts to feel slow. Conversations feel quiet. Moments feel incomplete. Presence feels underwhelming. Which brings us to a deeper realization. If anticipation can be hijacked this easily, what else in our lives is being shaped by it? Love, ambition, identity. And what happens when the brain expects constant novelty from things that were never meant to provide it? That's where we go next. Because the same system that keeps us scrolling also reshapes how we love. After thinking about social media, I started asking myself a different question. What if addiction isn't always obvious? What if it doesn't always look like chaos, or loss of control, or hitting rock bottom? What if it looks like discipline? What if it looks like being productive? We usually imagine addiction as something external. Alcohol, drugs, gambling, something you consume. But there's another kind, quieter, more respectable. Addictions where no one intervenes because from the outside, it looks like success. Think about gambling for a moment. Not the dramatic kind, not casinos and bright lights, but the psychological loop. The thrill isn't in winning. It's in almost winning. The near miss. The feeling that the next try could change everything. That's anticipation again. Now replace gambling with shopping. You don't need the item, but buying it feels like movement, progress, a small reset. And the moment it arrives, the excitement fades. So you look again. Now replace shopping with work, or self-improvement, or productivity. And suddenly this gets uncomfortable, because now we're talking about things we praise. Have you ever felt guilty for resting, even when you're exhausted? Have you ever finished one task only to feel anxious until the next one appears? Have you ever chased improvement without remembering why you started? That's not ambition. That's compulsion wearing a clean shirt. The brain doesn't care what you chase, only that you chase. Progress gives a hit. Completion gives a brief relief. Then the system resets and whispers, "What's next?" That's why people can become addicted to productivity, to optimizing routines, to checking boxes, to constantly improving themselves. Not because growth is bad, but because stopping feels wrong, like something is missing, like you're falling behind an invisible standard. The most dangerous part: these addictions don't destroy your life quickly. They stretch it thin. You stay functional, successful, respected. But slowly, joy becomes conditional, only allowed after achievement, only permitted once everything is done, which is never. Discipline turns into something else. Not choice, not intention, but pressure. An internal demand that doesn't negotiate, that doesn't listen, that doesn't rest. And when someone asks, why don't you just stop? The honest answer isn't dramatic. It's quiet. Because I don't know who I am if I do. That's the part we don't talk about. Addiction isn't just attachment, it's identity. If chasing stops, who are you? If progress pauses, what do you feel? If anticipation disappears, what fills the silence? So when we say, I should slow down, or I'll rest later, or just one more thing, we're not lying. We're negotiating with a system that doesn't understand enough. It only understands more. And this leads us to something deeper. If anticipation drives addiction, and addiction can hide inside discipline, then what happens to love, to relationships, to intimacy? Because the same brain that craves novelty also craves connection. And it doesn't always know the difference. That's where we go next. Because desire doesn't stop at screens or success. It follows us into the most human places of all. After realizing how anticipation can turn into addiction, another question surfaced. What happens when the system doesn't chase pleasure anymore, but threat? That's where anxiety begins. We usually think of anxiety as fear, but fear is about now. Anxiety is about later, about what might happen, about running futures in your head that never asked to be imagined. An anxious mind isn't broken, it's overworking. It's doing exactly what it evolved to do: predict. The problem is, it never turns off. Think about worry. Worry isn't emotion, it's simulation. A mental rehearsal of disasters. What if I mess this up? What if something goes wrong? What if I didn't see something coming? Each thought feels useful, protective, responsible. But none of them arrive at resolution. They just loop. The brain tells itself, if I stay alert, I'll be safe. So calm begins to feel dangerous. Silence feels suspicious. Peace feels like negligence. Have you noticed how hard it is to relax without feeling like you're forgetting something? That's anticipation misfiring. The system designed to prepare you starts preparing you for everything, all at once, all the time. Anxiety often masquerades as responsibility. You're not panicking, you're being careful. You're not overthinking, you're being thorough. You're not anxious, you're just prepared. But prepared for what? Most of the time, nothing. And here's the cruel irony. The brain doesn't calm down when you handle a situation, it calms down when it feels certainty. But certainty rarely arrives, so the mind stays open, scanning, predicting, preparing. That's why reassurance helps briefly and then fades. Because reassurance doesn't stop anticipation, it just pauses it. I once heard anxiety described this way. It's the feeling of living in the future without permission. You're mentally somewhere else while your body is stuck here. And the longer that gap exists, the harder presence becomes. That's why anxious people are often exhausted, not from action, but from constant mental motion. They've already lived through every possible version of tomorrow before tomorrow even arrives. And when nothing bad happens, the brain doesn't celebrate. It says, good thing I stayed alert, reinforcing the loop. So the system tightens. More anticipation, more vigilance, more preparation, less rest, less ease, less trust. And that's when anxiety becomes a way of life, not because something is wrong with you, but because the brain never learned how to stop predicting. If anticipation fuels anxiety, and anxiety feeds on uncertainty, what happens when life becomes more unpredictable? When certainty disappears entirely? That's where this story goes next, because anticipation doesn't just shape fear, it reshapes identity. After anxiety, something else often follows. Not immediately, not loudly. It arrives slowly, like a dimmer switch being turned down, one click at a time. This is where anticipation doesn't misfire. It goes silent. Depression is often misunderstood as sadness, but sadness still wants relief. Sadness still reaches. Depression doesn't. Depression is the absence of pull, the absence of forward motion. The system that once said go now says nothing. People struggling with depression often say something very specific. Not, "I feel terrible," but "I don't want anything anymore." That sentence is easy to overlook, but it says everything. After long periods of chasing success, improvement, stability, relief, the brain sometimes exhausts itself. Not physically, chemically, motivationally. The motivation engine burns too hot for too long, and eventually, it shuts down. This is what researchers call anhedonia. Not sadness, not despair, the inability to feel desire. Things that once mattered now feel distant. Hobbies feel pointless. Goals feel heavy. Future plans feel abstract. Not painful, just empty. And that emptiness is terrifying, because we're taught that wanting is life. Ambition is life. Drive is life. Hope is life. So when wanting disappears, people don't just feel low, they feel erased. The cruel part, the world often responds incorrectly. Try harder, be grateful, think positive. You just need motivation. But motivation isn't missing. The system is offline, and no amount of willpower can restart a circuit that's exhausted. Depression doesn't feel dramatic from the inside. It feels flat, gray, like watching life through thick glass. You're still here, but not participating. And because there's no obvious crisis, people don't know how to help. This is why depression is often mistaken for laziness, or lack of character, or weakness. But biologically, it's closer to a protective shutdown, the brain saying, "I can't keep chasing like this." There's something almost honest about it, brutal but honest. The system refuses to pretend anymore, refuses to simulate futures, refuses to promise happiness later. It simply stops asking you to move. And that's when the question changes. Not, "How do I achieve more?" Not, "How do I fix myself?" But, "What am I allowed to want without chasing?" Depression exposes a lie we rarely confront. That constant desire is sustainable. That endless anticipation is healthy. That always moving forward is normal. Sometimes, the silence isn't the problem. Sometimes, it's the signal. Which leads us to something delicate. If anxiety is anticipation trapped in fear, and depression is anticipation shut down entirely, then the real question isn't how to chase better. It's this: how do we relate to desire without letting it consume us or abandon us? That's where we go next. Because between anxiety and numbness, there is another possibility. One we almost never talk about. It felt necessary to pause. Not to fix anything, just to notice something we rarely notice, that there is another system quietly operating inside us, not loud, not urgent, not dramatic, so subtle that we often mistake it for nothing at all. A researcher once told me this almost casually. He said, "There are two systems running your life. One pulls you forward, the other lets you stay. We spend most of our lives listening to the first one, the one that wants more, the one that anticipates, the one that says, 'Next.' But the second system, it doesn't shout, it doesn't promise, it doesn't excite. It simply settles. This system doesn't live in the future. It lives right here, in small moments. A slow breath, a warm cup in your hands, a conversation that doesn't go anywhere. No climax, no rush, just enough. And that's why we miss it, because we've been taught that feeling alive should feel intense, that meaning should feel powerful, that happiness should feel like fireworks. But this system doesn't do fireworks. It does ground. Satisfaction doesn't announce itself. It doesn't feel impressive. It doesn't trend. It doesn't look like success. It feels like nothing is missing. And in a brain trained on anticipation, nothing missing feels empty. Have you noticed that peace often feels boring, that stillness feels awkward, that calm can feel like something is wrong? That's not because calm is bad. It's because calm doesn't stimulate the chasing system. Excitement pushes you forward. Satisfaction lets you stop. And stopping feels dangerous to a mind that learned survival through motion. This is why people can sit in a quiet room and suddenly feel restless, why vacations sometimes create anxiety, why success doesn't always bring relief. The system that calms us doesn't feel like progress. It feels like arrival, and arrival has no direction. We're not broken for overlooking it. We're conditioned. Modern life amplifies the loud system. Goals, metrics, updates, deadlines. Everything rewards movement. Very little rewards presence. But here's the truth we don't hear enough. A life driven only by anticipation burns out. A life lived only in stillness stagnates. The balance isn't choosing one over the other. It's knowing when to switch. The problem isn't desire. The problem is forgetting how to feel complete without achievement. This quieter system doesn't erase pain. It doesn't fix the world. It doesn't solve the future. It simply stabilizes you enough to exist inside the present moment. And sometimes that's enough. Which leads to a difficult realization. We don't suffer because we want too much. We suffer because we don't recognize the moments when wanting can rest. And if we never learn that, we'll keep chasing relief instead of allowing it. So the question becomes, if both systems are necessary, how do we live with them without being dragged by either? That's where we go next. Because understanding this changes how we relate to work, love, rest, and ultimately to ourselves. There's a strange moment that happens when life finally slows down. Nothing is wrong, nothing is urgent, nothing is pulling at you. And instead of relief, you feel restless, almost uncomfortable, as if something important is missing. We rarely admit this, but contentment often feels boring, not peaceful, not fulfilling, just flat. And the instinctive reaction is to fix it, to add noise, add goals, add stimulation, anything but stay. Stillness doesn't announce itself. It doesn't arrive with fireworks or milestones. It doesn't say, "This is it, you made it." It simply shows up as a moment where nothing demands you. And for a mind trained on stimulation, that feels wrong. We live in a culture where excitement is proof of value. If something matters, it should energize you. If it's meaningful, it should motivate you. If it's good, it should feel intense. So when calm arrives quietly, we dismiss it. We scroll, we plan, we chase the next thing. Peace doesn't trend. No one posts about a normal, stable afternoon. No one celebrates a week without drama. No one brags about feeling okay. Calm doesn't perform well in a world built on attention. There's also fear hiding underneath boredom. Because when everything slows down, something surfaces. Thoughts you've been outrunning, questions you've been postponing, feelings you haven't labeled. Stimulation protects us from that. Stillness removes the shield. That's why silence feels empty at first. Not because it is empty, but because it's unfamiliar. We've trained our minds to expect constant input, so when input stops, the mind panics. It mistakes quiet for absence, rest for stagnation, enough for lack. But contentment was never meant to excite you. It was meant to hold you, to give your nervous system a place to land. The problem isn't that calm is boring. The problem is that we expect calm to entertain us, and it never will. Learning to stay is a skill. It doesn't feel productive, it doesn't feel impressive, it doesn't feel shareable. But it's necessary. Because without it, life becomes a series of pursuits with no arrival. This is why people feel uneasy after achieving long-term goals, why vacations feel oddly disappointing, why retirement scares people, why weekends feel shorter than they should. When the chase pauses, we don't know what to do with ourselves. So we restart the cycle. New goal, new desire, new anticipation. Not because we need more, but because we don't know how to live without wanting. Contentment isn't the absence of desire. It's the ability to let desire rest. And that takes practice. You don't learn it by quitting ambition. You learn it by noticing moments that don't ask for improvement. Moments that don't need to lead anywhere. Moments that simply are. If contentment feels boring to you, it's not because your life lacks meaning. It's because your mind has forgotten how to be still without feeling lost. The chase taught us how to move, but no one taught us how to stop. And when a system built on anticipation can't stop, it doesn't just create restlessness. It starts to turn against itself. Because when wanting has nowhere to go, it becomes something else entirely. Which brings us to the next chapter. When desire doesn't find satisfaction, it often disguises itself as something darker. There's a moment in most relationships that no one prepares you for. It's not the first argument. It's not the first disappointment. It's the moment when nothing dramatic happens. The fire doesn't explode. It doesn't end. It simply cools. In the beginning, love is anticipation, waiting for messages, reading meaning into pauses, feeling electricity in small moments. Your mind is constantly reaching forward. What will happen next? What does this mean? Where is this going? And then, one day the questions quiet down, not because love is gone, but because it has arrived. That's when many people panic. They mistake arrival for decline, familiarity for loss, stability for boredom. They say things like, "It doesn't feel the same anymore." And they're right. It doesn't. Because it was never meant to stay that way. Passion lives in anticipation. It thrives on uncertainty, novelty, and possibility. But anticipation can't be permanent. If it were, love would never feel safe, never feel grounded, never feel like home. Long-term love doesn't burn, it glows, quietly, consistently, without demanding attention. And for minds trained to chase intensity, that glow can feel underwhelming. We've been taught to equate intensity with depth. If it's not thrilling, it must be failing. If it's not dramatic, it must be fading. But depth isn't loud. Depth is what remains when excitement no longer performs. Intimacy after the fire looks different. It's not the rush of being chosen. It's the comfort of being known. It's sitting in silence without needing to fill it. It's ordinary mornings, shared routines, unremarkable evenings that don't need explaining. And that can feel scary, because without fireworks, there's nothing to distract us. No chemical high, no chase, no illusion of more just around the corner. Just two people, present. This is where many relationships quietly end, not with betrayal, not with conflict, but with restlessness. One person starts to wonder, is this it? Not realizing that this is what they were running toward the entire time. Choosing depth over intensity is an act of courage, because depth doesn't seduce you. It asks you to stay. Staying means accepting that love won't always stimulate you. Sometimes it will calm you. Sometimes it will ground you. Sometimes it will feel neutral. And neutrality terrifies a mind addicted to anticipation. We talk a lot about falling in love. We talk very little about remaining in love. Remaining requires a different skill set. Less imagination, more presence. Less projection, more attention. Novelty fades. That's not a flaw. That's a transition. The question is not whether the fire dies. The question is whether you can live without needing it to keep burning. Some people leave to feel alive again. Others stay and learn something harder. That love doesn't always move you forward. Sometimes it invites you to arrive. And if you've built your identity around wanting, arrival can feel like emptiness. But emptiness is often just space. Space to see the other person clearly. Space to see yourself without distraction. Space to build something slower, deeper, and quieter. Love after the fire doesn't promise excitement. It offers something rarer, a place where anticipation rests and presence begins. But what happens when anticipation doesn't just quiet down? What happens when it breaks? When the system that pushes us forward shuts off entirely? That's where we're going next. After learning how anticipation drives love and how its absence can feel like loss, there's an uncomfortable question left hanging. If this system pushes us endlessly forward and stopping makes us anxious, does that mean we're trapped? Or can we learn to work with it? The researcher once told me something quietly hopeful. He said, "The problem isn't wanting. The problem is not knowing when wanting is driving you and when it's dragging you." That distinction matters, because the same system that makes us restless is also the reason anything meaningful ever gets built. Curiosity, creativity, exploration, progress. None of these happen without anticipation, the urge to find out, to improve, to see what's possible. The question isn't how to eliminate that urge, it's how to relate to it. There's a difference between pursuit and hunger. Pursuit has direction. Hunger has no finish line. One asks, "What am I working toward?" The other whispers, "It's still not enough." Healthy curiosity feels open. It pulls you forward, then lets you rest. It excites you, then releases you. Obsession tightens. It doesn't let go. It doesn't settle. It doesn't allow completion to count. You can feel the difference in your body. Curiosity feels light. Hunger feels urgent. Curiosity allows pauses. Hunger punishes them. This is why burnout doesn't come from effort alone. It comes from effort without arrival, from chasing progress without permission to stop. Many creative people don't burn out because they love what they do. They burn out because the brain never registers done. Every milestone becomes a stepping stone. Every success becomes pressure. The system keeps whispering, "Good, now more." But dopamine was never meant to be a master. It's a tool, a spark, a starting signal, not a life philosophy. When used consciously, it becomes powerful. You use it to begin projects, to explore ideas, to learn. And then you switch modes. You finish, you integrate, you rest. That switching is everything. Without it, progress becomes addiction. With it, progress becomes craftsmanship. Curiosity without obsession looks like this. You're interested, but not consumed. Engaged, but not frantic. Motivated, but not self-punishing. You don't confuse movement with meaning. The healthiest creators know something quietly radical. Not every idea needs to be chased. Not every desire needs to be satisfied. Not every possibility needs to be explored. They let some sparks fade. And that restraint isn't weakness, it's maturity. Using this system consciously means asking different questions. Not, how do I stay motivated, but what deserves my motivation? Not, what's next, but is this enough for now? Progress doesn't require constant hunger. It requires direction, boundaries, and rest. And rest isn't the enemy of creation. It's what makes creation sustainable. When desire becomes a servant instead of a ruler, something shifts. You still move forward, you still build, you still grow, but you no longer disappear into the chase. And maybe that's the real goal. Not killing ambition, not silencing curiosity, but learning how to hold desire gently so it works for you instead of consuming you. Because when desire finally loosens its grip, something else quietly asks for attention. Not excitement, not progress, but meaning. And that's where we go next. The researcher once said something that surprised me. He didn't talk about fixing the brain, or hacking chemistry, or escaping desire. He said, the moment you can name what's happening, it loses its authority over you. That stayed with me, because it suggests something simple, but radical. Maybe freedom doesn't come from changing how the brain works. Maybe it comes from recognizing when it's at work. Most of the time, desire feels personal. It feels like you. I want. I need. I should. But once you learn to recognize the pattern, the anticipation, the restlessness, the subtle pull forward, it stops feeling like destiny. It starts feeling like a process. And processes can be interrupted. Naming the feeling is the first crack in the loop. Instead of saying, I'm bored, you say, my brain is searching for stimulation. Instead of, I need something new, you say, anticipation is looking for fuel. That shift sounds small, but it's powerful. Because what you can observe, you're no longer fully inside. Awareness creates space. Not to suppress desire, but to choose. Most of modern life removes that space. Everything is designed to respond instantly. Scroll, click, refresh, buy, react. No pause, no friction, no moment to ask, do I actually want this? The system thrives on speed, but the human nervous system doesn't. This is why rewiring the cycle isn't about willpower, it's about environment. The brain responds to what's around it far more than what we promise ourselves. If you remove friction, impulse wins. If you add friction, awareness has time to step in. That's not a moral failure. That's biology. Pauses matter more than discipline. A pause between thought and action, between urge and response, between wanting and doing. Even a few seconds can change the outcome. This is why small limits work better than big resolutions. Not, "I'll never scroll again," but "I won't scroll before noon." Not, "I'll stop chasing achievement," but "I won't plan the next goal tonight." These aren't restrictions, they're containers. And containers make freedom possible. The researcher called this designing for sanity. Not optimizing life, not maximizing productivity, but protecting the mind from constant stimulation. Because the brain doesn't know when enough is enough. It only knows there might be more. So we have to decide. Learning when not to want is a skill. And it feels uncomfortable at first, because silence feels strange to a brain trained on noise. Stillness feels empty to a system wired for pursuit. The first time you don't reach for distraction, you might feel restless. The second time, bored. The third time, something else appears. Thoughts, memories, emotions you've been outrunning. This is why we avoid stillness, not because it's empty, but because it's full. Choosing intention over impulse doesn't mean becoming passive. It means acting on purpose. You still desire, you still pursue, but not automatically. You start asking different questions. Not, "What do I feel like doing?" but "What actually matters right now?" Not, "What's next?" but "What deserves my attention?" This is the beginning of rewiring, not through force, but through relationship. You stop fighting the system. You stop obeying it blindly. You listen. And something unexpected happens. When you stop feeding anticipation constantly, it becomes quieter. Not gone, just calmer. Less demanding, less frantic. You begin to notice satisfaction again. Small moments, ordinary moments, moments that don't promise a future, but feel complete as they are. That's not failure. That's balance. The cycle doesn't disappear, but it loosens. And in that looseness, you gain something rare in modern life. Choice. Choice to pause. Choice to rest. Choice to stop chasing without guilt. Choice to move forward without being pushed. The researcher smiled when I asked him if this was enough. He said, "Enough isn't a destination. It's a practice." And maybe that's the most honest answer. You don't escape the system. You don't defeat it. You befriend it and learn when to listen and when to let it pass. Because once the noise quiets, another question starts to emerge. Not about wanting, but about meaning. And that's where this story is slowly leading. There's something the researcher made very clear before we parted ways. You don't defeat the system. You don't silence it. You don't outgrow it. You don't become above it. Because it isn't a flaw. It's a feature. This chemical, this wanting system helped us survive. It pulled us toward food, shelter, connection. It pushed us to explore, invent, adapt. Without it, we wouldn't be here. So the goal was never to remove it. The goal was to stop mistaking its voice for truth. That distinction changes everything. Because when desire shows up, it feels authoritative, urgent, convincing, personal. It says, "This matters. This is who you are. This will complete you." But it's lying, quietly. Not maliciously, just mechanically. Desire is motion, not identity. It points, it nudges, it activates. But it doesn't decide what's meaningful. We do. The mistake most of us make is confusing movement with direction. Just because you're driven doesn't mean you're going somewhere worth arriving. Just because something excites you doesn't mean it deserves your life. When we're young, this system feels magical. Everything ahead feels charged with possibility. The future glows. The present feels temporary. But at some point, the glow turns into pressure. And the future becomes a place we never reach because we're always standing just before it. That's when the molecule of more stops feeling like fuel and starts feeling like a leash. Living with it doesn't mean slowing down forever. It means knowing when speed is useful and when it's noise. It means recognizing that not every urge deserves obedience, that not every desire needs to become a goal. Peace, the researcher said, isn't something you stumble into. It's a skill. And like any skill, it feels awkward at first. Peace doesn't shout. It doesn't sparkle. It doesn't promise transformation. It whispers. It feels quiet. And to a brain trained on anticipation, quiet feels like something's missing. But nothing is missing. What's missing is the chase. When you stop chasing for a moment, you might feel uneasy, as if you're falling behind, as if life is moving without you. But slowly, very slowly, another sensation emerges: groundedness, presence, a sense that you're here, not reaching. This doesn't mean you stop wanting. It means you stop letting want define you. You still build, still create, still move forward. But now, movement is chosen, not compelled. The researcher didn't offer techniques or routines or hacks. He offered a lens. And through that lens, life looks different. You start noticing how often more disguises itself as purpose, how often restlessness pretends to be ambition, how often dissatisfaction pretends to be depth. And once you see it, really see it, you don't have to fight it. You just don't fall for it as easily. And maybe that's enough. Not happiness, not fulfillment, not enlightenment, just clarity. So here's the question that stays with me, the one that doesn't demand an answer, only honesty. What if you stopped chasing more and started choosing enough? Not as a finish line, not as a retreat, but as a way of living. You're not broken. You're not ungrateful. You're not failing at life. You're human, with a brain built for pursuit, living in a world that never lets you arrive. Understanding that doesn't end the tension, but it softens it. And sometimes, softening is the most radical thing we can do. And now, it's your turn to decide what you chase next. And that's it for today, my friend. You were listening to Wise Alchemy. The story ends here for now, but you and I, we'll meet again. Thank you.